The sun dipped low over Aurora, Illinois, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban streets. The evening air carried the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves as an old golden retriever mix named Buddy made his usual rounds. Once, Buddy had been a beloved pet, living a comfortable life. But after his elderly owner passed away, he found himself wandering the streets, a gentle drifter who had captured the hearts of the community. Despite attempts from neighbors and shelters to take him in, Buddy always slipped away. He preferred the freedom of the outdoors. The streets were his home now, and he had a routine, one that led him past familiar houses where kind-hearted people left out food and water for him. Tonight was no different. As Buddy padded through the streets, he stopped by Mrs. Abigail Turner's house, where a fresh bowl of water sat waiting on the porch. Lapping up the cool liquid, he wagged his tail in silent thanks as Mrs. Turner called from the window. "There you are, old boy. Be careful out there, okay?" Buddy gave a small woof in response before continuing on his way. His paws led him toward Lakewood Park, a place he often roamed at night. The playground was empty, the swings swaying slightly in the evening breeze. Then, a sound stopped him in his tracks. A sharp, high-pitched cry. Buddy's ears perked up, his body going still. He knew the sounds of the night: raccoons rustling in the bushes, distant sirens, the occasional barking of another dog. But this was different. His nose twitched as he followed the faint cries, weaving between trash bins near the playground. The sound grew louder, more desperate. When he reached the last bin, Buddy rose on his hind legs, resting his paws against the metal rim. Peering inside, his heart pounded. There, nestled among discarded fast food wrappers and crumpled newspapers, was a tiny newborn baby, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket. The infant's tiny fists clenched and unclenched, its face scrunched in distress. It let out a weak cry, barely strong enough to break the silence of the night. For a long moment, Buddy didn't move. How will the story unfold? Before we get into the details, we would love to know which country you're watching from. And I would love it if you enjoyed the story and subscribed to the channel. Something deep within him stirred, a long-buried instinct, something stronger than hunger or the need for shelter. With delicate care, he gripped the edge of the blanket in his teeth and lifted the baby out of the trash. The infant squirmed, letting out another soft whimper as Buddy's warm fur pressed against it. Buddy didn't know much about the world of humans, but he knew one thing: this tiny creature needed help, and he was the only one who could give it. With the determination of a dog half his age, Buddy turned and began to run. There was only one person he trusted to save this child: Margaret Thompson, the retired nurse who lived on Willow Street. His legs burned, his old joints aching, but he pushed forward. This baby's life depended on him now. A race against time. The night air felt colder than usual as Buddy ran through the dimly lit streets of Aurora, Illinois. His old joints ached with each step, but he ignored the pain. His focus was on the fragile bundle he carried. The newborn baby, barely wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket, had stopped crying. That terrified him more than anything. The infant was too still, too quiet. Buddy pushed himself harder. The familiar streets blurred past him, but he knew exactly where he was going: Willow Street, where Margaret Thompson lived. Margaret had always been kind to strays. Though she never owned a dog herself, she often left food outside for wandering animals. But more importantly, Buddy knew she was a healer. Even in his simple canine understanding, he had seen her tending to injured birds and abandoned kittens, her hands always gentle, steady, full of warmth. If anyone could save this baby, it was her. As he turned onto Willow Street, his paws hit the pavement harder. His breath came in ragged pants, but he refused to slow down. The streets were mostly empty, the few people who remained outside too shocked to react. A teenager on a bike nearly crashed into a lamppost as he did a double take. "Dude, was that a dog carrying a baby?" he muttered, watching in stunned disbelief as Buddy raced past. One woman gasped, dropping her grocery bags, but before she could call for help, the dog had already disappeared down the street. Buddy's tired legs burned as he finally reached Margaret's house, a small, cozy home with a bright blue door and a porch light glowing in the darkness. With one last burst of strength, Buddy climbed the 3 wooden steps, his paws trembling with exhaustion. Gently, he laid the baby down on the welcome mat, using his nose to nudge the blanket more securely around the tiny body. Then he barked, a sharp, urgent sound, one Margaret hadn't heard from him before. Inside, Margaret Thompson sat in her armchair, lost in a novel, her reading glasses perched low on her nose. The first bark made her look up. The second made her frown. When the third bark came, louder, more insistent, she knew something was wrong. Setting her book down, she moved quickly toward the door, flipping on the porch light. The sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs. Buddy stood there, panting heavily, his graying muzzle pressed close to a small, wriggling bundle on her welcome mat. For a moment, she couldn't process what she was seeing. Then instinct took over. "Oh my God," she whispered, dropping to her knees. With trembling hands, she pulled back the blanket, revealing a tiny, shivering baby. Margaret's breath caught. The baby's skin was far too cold, its tiny lips a shade of blue. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, carefully scooping the infant into her arms. Buddy let out a soft whine, his worried brown eyes never leaving the baby. Margaret's decades of experience in neonatal care kicked in. She pressed 2 fingers against the baby's chest, feeling the faint, uneven heartbeat. Hypothermia. The baby had been in that trash bin too long. Margaret stood quickly, clutching the child to her chest. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she murmured as she hurried inside. Buddy followed, his job not yet finished. Inside, Margaret moved with the precision of an experienced nurse. She grabbed a soft towel from the linen closet, wrapping the baby securely. Then, she turned on a space heater, positioning it nearby to help raise the baby's temperature slowly. Too fast, and it could be dangerous. With her free hand, she reached for the phone and dialed 911. 911. "What's your emergency?" "This is Margaret Thompson. I'm at 247 Willow Street. I have a newborn infant here, found outside suffering from hypothermia. I need an ambulance immediately." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, but Margaret could hear the urgency beneath it. "Help is on the way. Do you know how long the baby has been exposed?" Margaret glanced at Buddy, who stood beside her, still watching over the infant. I don't know. He found her. He brought her to me?" A beat of silence. "The dogs?" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "A stray, but I don't think he's just any dog." The baby let out a faint, trembling whimper. Margaret's chest tightened with relief. She was still fighting. "Stay with me, little one," she whispered. Buddy let out another soft whine, nudging Margaret's knee as if to say, "You have to fix this." She would. She had to. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens broke through the quiet night. Buddy's ears perked, but he didn't move from his spot. As the red and blue lights flooded the street, Margaret clutched the baby closer and whispered, "You're safe now." Buddy finally sat, letting out a long breath. His mission wasn't over yet, but for the first time all night, he knew help had arrived. A miracle in the making. The flashing red and blue lights bathed Willow Street in an eerie glow as the ambulance screeched to a stop in front of Margaret Thompson's house. The moment the paramedics jumped out, Margaret hurried onto the porch, the fragile newborn baby wrapped tightly in a warm towel against her chest. "She's ice cold," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Possible hypothermia, weak cry, shallow breathing. I've started passive rewarming." One of the paramedics, a young woman named Aisha Carter, nodded briskly as she took the baby from Margaret's arms, her hands gentle yet efficient. Beside her, her partner, a seasoned veteran named Frank Delaney, quickly assessed the situation. "Where did you find the baby?" Frank asked, his eyes scanning the quiet street. Margaret hesitated, then looked down at Buddy, who stood beside her, his golden fur matted and dirty from his desperate run through the city. "He found her." Aisha paused mid-checkup. "Wait, what?" Margaret swallowed hard. Buddy found her in a trash bin at Lakewood Park. "He carried her here." Frank's weathered face twitched with disbelief. He'd seen plenty in his 20 years as a paramedic, but this was a first. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, shaking his head in amazement. That dog's a hero. Buddy, as if sensing the weight of his actions, simply sat by the ambulance, his soft brown eyes never leaving the baby. She's stable for now, Aisha said, adjusting the infant's blanket. But we need to move fast. Margaret's heart clenched as the paramedics rushed the baby into the ambulance, strapping her into a tiny warming unit designed for fragile newborns. Without thinking, she took a step forward. I'm coming with you. Aisha and Frank exchanged a glance. You a nurse? Margaret lifted her chin. 30 years in the NICU. Chicago Memorial. Frank let out a low whistle. Then let's go. Margaret climbed into the ambulance, barely noticing the moment Buddy followed her inside. Ma'am, the dog. He stays, Margaret said firmly, her hand resting on Buddy's worn head. He's already saved her once. Let him see it through. Aisha, clearly moved, nodded. All right, let's get this baby to Aurora General Hospital. The doors slammed shut, and the ambulance sped into the night. A life on the line. The emergency room at Aurora General Hospital was already buzzing when they arrived. Nurses and doctors stood ready, awaiting the baby's arrival. As soon as the paramedics wheeled the infant inside, a commanding voice cut through the chaos. Bring her. Dr. Liam Reeves, one of the hospital's top pediatric surgeons, stepped forward, his sharp eyes assessing the baby's condition immediately. Margaret recognized him instantly. She hadn't seen him in years, but he hadn't changed much. The same focused intensity, the same way he ran a hand through his hair when stressed. She's hypothermic, Aisha reported. Found in a trash bin. This dog carried her to a nurse's house. Dr. Reeves barely reacted. Core temp dropped to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. Weak respiratory effort. Possible congenital complications. Margaret stepped closer. She needs full warming protocols now. Dr. Reeves shot her a glance of recognition. Margaret Thompson? Margaret nodded. It's been a while. Despite the situation, the doctor cracked a small smile. You sure know how to make an entrance. Then, back to work. As the nurses rushed to stabilize the baby, Margaret stood by, helpless for the first time in years. She had spent decades in this very environment, saving the tiniest, most fragile lives. And now, here she was, watching a baby fight for survival, a baby that a stray dog had saved. A gentle nudge at her knee. She looked down to find Buddy beside her, sitting right outside the NICU doors, his tail still, his gaze fixed on the tiny figure in the incubator. He won't leave, Aisha murmured, watching the dog. Margaret swallowed past the lump in her throat. Neither will I. A shocking revelation. An hour passed. Then two. Margaret paced outside the NICU, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, while Buddy stood guard, watching every nurse and doctor who passed. Finally, the doors swung open, and Dr. Reeves stepped out, exhaustion written all over his face. She made it through the first critical stage, he said, rubbing his eyes. But there's something else. Margaret's stomach tightened. What? Dr. Reeves exhaled heavily. She has a congenital heart defect, a rare one, tetralogy of Fallot with pulmonary atresia. Margaret felt her knees go weak. Tetralogy of Fallot was bad enough, a condition that disrupted the way blood flowed through the heart. But pulmonary atresia meant her pulmonary valve hadn't developed properly at all. She's going to need surgery, Dr. Reeves said. Soon, and it's not going to be easy. Margaret steadied herself, years of medical knowledge kicking in. What are her odds? Dr. Reeves hesitated. It's risky, especially in a newborn. Margaret let out a slow breath, glancing at Buddy, who was still watching them closely, as if he understood every word. This dog didn't save her just to lose her now, she said firmly. Dr. Reeves studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then let's fight for her. Margaret nodded back. They weren't going to give up on this little girl. Not now. Not after everything she had already survived. And with Buddy by her side, Margaret knew they wouldn't let her down. The truth unfolds. The quiet hum of machines filled the NICU at Aurora General Hospital, where the tiny newborn, now nicknamed Baby Hope, lay in a temperature-controlled incubator. Wires and monitors tracked her every breath, every heartbeat. Outside the NICU, Margaret Thompson sat with Buddy curled up beside her, his warm body pressed against her leg. Neither of them had moved much since baby Hope had been admitted. Neither of them would leave her now. A voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret looked up to see Detective Maya Chin standing before her, a leather notebook tucked under her arm. With her sharp eyes and purposeful stride, it was clear she was here for answers. Margaret straightened. "Detective, I wanted to update you on the investigation." Chin glanced at Buddy, a flicker of admiration in her expression. "I still can't believe this dog carried a baby across town to find help." Margaret smiled faintly, running a hand over Buddy's fur. "Neither can I." "But he did." Chin nodded. "We pulled security footage from Lakewood Park, and it confirms Buddy found baby Hope in the trash bin. He even tried to get several people's attention before deciding to bring her to you." Margaret's heart tightened. "And no one stopped to help?" Chin's jaw clenched. "Not one." Margaret exhaled sharply. The world could be cruel, but it could also be kind. And right now, that kindness had come from a stray dog with a heart bigger than most humans. "Do you have any leads on the mother?" she asked. Chin sighed, flipping open her notebook. "We're working on it. The baby was only a few days old when she was abandoned. No hospital records matching her birth so far. We're checking nearby clinics and home births." She hesitated. "But cases like this, they're not always easy to solve." Margaret refused to accept that. "This little girl deserves to know where she came from," she said firmly. Chin gave her a long, appraising look before nodding. "We'll keep digging." A disturbance in the hospital. Later that evening, as Margaret stood by baby Hope's incubator, a sharp voice echoed down the hallway. "I don't care what you say. That dog is a stray and a health hazard. He needs to be removed immediately." Margaret's head snapped up. She stepped out of the NICU just in time to see Gerald Hawkins, the head of the local animal control department, standing at the nurse's station. His expression was stern, impatient. "I want him taken to a shelter," Hawkins continued, jabbing a finger toward Buddy, who stood protectively beside Margaret. "We can't have an unvaccinated stray wandering a hospital." Margaret marched forward. "Excuse me, Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "But this isn't just some stray. Buddy is a hero. He saved a baby's life." Hawkins snorted. "Hero or not, regulations are regulations." A new voice cut in. "And sometimes exceptions are made." Margaret turned to see Dr. Liam Reeves approaching, his white coat swaying as he walked. His expression was calm, but his tone carried authority. Hawkins frowned. "And you are?" "I'm the attending physician on baby Hope's case," Dr. Reeves said. "And I can tell you that Buddy's presence has been incredibly beneficial for this baby." He glanced at Margaret before adding, "In fact, I'd like to register Buddy as a therapy dog in training." Margaret's eyes widened. Hawkins sputtered. "That's not how it works. There are procedures, certifications. We can fast-track the process," Dr. Reeves interrupted. Given the extraordinary circumstances, Margaret's heart swelled with gratitude. Hawkins glared at them both, but he could see he was outnumbered. Finally, with a frustrated sigh, he relented. "Fine," he muttered, "but I'll be watching." As he stalked off, Margaret turned to Dr. Reeves. "Liam, thank you." Dr. Reeves smiled. "He deserves it." Margaret looked down at Buddy, who was watching them with his deep, knowing eyes. "You hear that, boy?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "Looks like you just got yourself a job." Buddy let out a soft, happy woof, his tail thumping against the hospital floor. For the first time in days, Margaret let herself hope. Baby Hope had a future, and thanks to Buddy, she had a protector for life. The mother's heartbreaking story. It was just past midnight when Detective Maya Chun returned to Aurora General Hospital. Her expression was unreadable, but the tightness in her posture told Margaret Thompson that something had changed. Margaret, who had been sitting just outside the NICU, straightened. Buddy, ever watchful, lifted his head from where he had been curled at her feet. "Detective?" Margaret asked, her voice laced with hope and hesitation. Chin sighed, rubbing the back of her neck. "We found her." Margaret's breath caught. "The mother?" Chin nodded. She turned herself in. Margaret's heart pounded as she followed Chun down the corridor. When they reached the waiting area, Margaret's eyes fell on a young girl sitting in a chair, her hands clutched together in her lap. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17. Her red-rimmed eyes told Margaret she had been crying for hours. "This is Zoe Matthews," Chen said gently. "She's baby Hope's mother." Margaret's heart clenched. The girl looked so small, her body curled in on itself, as if she wished she could disappear. When she finally looked up, her eyes were full of fear, guilt, and something else, desperation. Margaret sat down across from her. "Zoe," she said softly. The girl swallowed hard. Is she okay?" Her voice cracked. Margaret's face softened. "She's safe. She's getting the best care possible." Zoe let out a shuddering sob, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she whispered. I didn't know what else to do." Margaret reached out, placing a hand over Zoe's trembling fingers. "Tell me," she urged. "Tell me what happened." Zoe's story spilled out in broken, gasping breaths. She had been a straight-A student with dreams of going to medical school. But when she found out she was pregnant, everything fell apart. Her parents were strict, traditional, and had made it clear that a baby would ruin her future. So, she had hidden the pregnancy. She had given birth alone, in her bedroom, too scared to tell anyone. She had no plan, no idea what to do. Then, in a moment of pure panic, she had wrapped the baby in a blanket and taken her to the park, hoping someone would find her before it was too late. The moment she walked away, she regretted it. "I went back," she sobbed. "I went back an hour later, but she was gone. I thought," she choked on the words, "I thought she had died." Margaret squeezed her hand. She didn't. She survived. Zoe let out another shaky breath, tears falling freely. "Because of him," she whispered, her eyes falling on Buddy, who had been watching her the entire time. Buddy let out a soft whine, inching closer. Zoe hesitated before reaching out, her fingers brushing against his golden fur. Margaret felt her throat tighten. This girl didn't need judgment. She needed help. "Zoe," Margaret said gently, "would you like to see your daughter?" Zoe nodded through her tears. Margaret stood and reached out a hand. "Come on," she whispered. "She's waiting for you." With Buddy by their side, they walked toward the NICU, toward the second chance Zoe never thought she'd have. The fight for survival. As Zoe Matthews followed Margaret Thompson down the quiet halls of Aurora General Hospital, her hands trembled. Every step felt heavier, as if the weight of her choices was pressing down on her shoulders. Beside her, Buddy walked silently, his golden fur brushing against her leg. She glanced down at him, the dog who had saved her daughter. He had done what she couldn't. He had protected her. Margaret stopped outside the NICU, pressing the button to enter. The doors slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing the softly lit room filled with the steady hum of machines. Zoe's breath caught in her throat. There, inside a temperature-controlled incubator, was her baby, tiny, fragile, covered in wires and tubes. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors filled the silence, a constant reminder that her little girl was fighting for her life. "She's so small," Zoe whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's a fighter." Slowly, Zoe stepped forward, pressing her fingers against the clear plastic of the incubator. Tears welled in her eyes as she took in the sight of her daughter, her tiny hands clenched into fists, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Her name is Lily Hope," Margaret said softly. "She's been waiting for you." Zoe's breath hitched. "Lily," she whispered. The name felt right. It felt like hope. Behind them, Dr. Liam Reeves entered, a clipboard in hand. His expression was serious. "How is she?" Margaret asked. Dr. Reeves let out a slow sigh. "She's stable for now, but the congenital heart defect is a real concern. She needs surgery soon." Zoe whipped around. "Surgery?" Dr. Reeves nodded. "She has tetralogy of Fallot with pulmonary atresia. It's a rare condition, but we've caught it early. The good news is that with surgery, she has a strong chance at a normal life." Zoe felt her knees go weak. She had barely come to terms with the fact that her baby was alive. And now, she might lose her again? Margaret caught her as she swayed slightly. "Zoe, listen to me," she said firmly. "This hospital has some of the best pediatric surgeons. Lily has a chance, but she needs you to be strong." Zoe squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push back the fear. "What if I make things worse? What if I left her out there for too long? Dr. Reeves' expression softened. She's alive because of you, he said simply. Zoe shook her head. No, she's alive because of him. She turned to Buddy, who sat quietly beside the incubator, his brown eyes locked on Lily. He hadn't moved from his spot, hadn't looked away, not once. Dr. Reeves nodded slightly, acknowledging the dog's role in this miracle. And because of both of you, we have a chance to save her. Zoe wiped her tears, taking a deep, shaky breath. What do we do? She asked, her voice steadier now. Dr. Reeves gestured toward a nearby chair. Sit. I'll walk you through the procedure. As he explained the complex surgery, Zoe listened, holding on to every word. She had run away before, but not this time. This time, she would fight for her daughter, just like Buddy had. And no matter what happened next, she wouldn't leave Lily again.